The greatest untold story of World War II, Operation Halyard. A daring rescue of 512 Allied airmen trapped behind enemy lines, conducted mostly under broad daylight. Orchestrated by the Office of Strategic Services (OSS) and a Serbian guerrilla, General Draza Mihailovic, this mission remains shrouded in conspiracy and silence. Why did the US, British, and Yugoslav governments bury this tale of heroism and sacrifice? Dive into an adventure of danger, heroics, and the unsung heroes who defied the Nazis in the hills of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, August 1944. This village seemed just like every other village Claire Musgrove had been through in the last 4 days. Simple stone and thatch houses with minimal furnishings and even less food, occupied by people who welcomed him even though he had no idea who they were or what they intended to do with him. The smoke of a long smoldering fireplace mixed with the earthy aroma of wet hay and livestock, the same pungent smells that permeated every one of these villages. Following the gesture of his armed escort, he entered the small house and looked nervously around, trying to assess what might happen. For all he knew, this was it. This was where they were bringing him. Was it some sort of safe house where he could hide from the Germans without running all the time? He had wondered that at every village where he and the other American airmen stopped in the past days, but each one turned out to be just a waypoint on a journey to somewhere. Musgrove and the other bomber crewmen had no idea where they were being taken by these local escorts with guns. Hell, they weren't even sure they were being taken anywhere. As far as he could tell, they were just being passed around from one village to the next, in search of a few bits of goat cheese and scraps of bread so stale that Musgrove thought he might be better off eating his shoes. They had no idea what fate awaited them, but they were fairly confident that they wouldn't be turned over to the Germans. Though the Americans and the local Serb people couldn't communicate in anything but gestures and facial expressions, the airmen got the idea that these swarthy people were on their side. The women had nursed their wounds and fed them as best they could, and the men had provided protection from the Nazi patrols that were always on the lookout for Allied airmen whose planes crashed before they could get back to safe territory. Though it seemed these locals were trustworthy, Musgrove still was apprehensive. The bomber crews had been warned that some of the Yugoslav people were Nazi sympathizers and might turn them over to the Germans who had occupied their country since 1941. In fact, they'd been warned that the people in this area would cut off the downed airmen's ears and then turn the men over to the Germans. But the burly men escorting the Americans seemed friendly enough. Then again, they were the ones with the rifles. Could they be taking Musgrove and the others somewhere else before handing them over? Possibly to a German unit that offered rewards for American airmen? It didn't seem likely, but Musgrove couldn't help worrying that this curious trip would not end well. He was at the mercy of people he couldn't understand, and they were moving him around from one place to another instead of just letting the Americans hide out. Musgrove also wondered if anyone was looking for them. He hoped he and the other downed airmen hadn't been forgotten, left for dead in Nazi territory. Musgrove had been on this mysterious journey for 4 days, since bailing out of his B-24 bomber over northern Yugoslavia, behind enemy lines. His 8th mission, to bomb the oil fields of Ploiesti, Romania, a critical source of fuel for the German war machine, turned out to be his last. All in all, Musgrove felt lucky to be alive and without serious injuries, unlike some of the Americans in his group. One of the men broke his leg badly on landing in his parachute, and every time he grimaced in pain during the all-day hikes, Musgrove was grateful that all he could complain about was hunger, the occasional thirst, and being tired. Knowing how narrowly he had escaped his crippled bomber, Musgrove was happy to be walking around anywhere instead of dead in the wreckage. And with all the German patrols in this area, he was also glad that he could walk along without a German shoving the muzzle of his rifle in his back. Musgrove had gotten out of the bomber so late, just before it crashed into the mountains of Yugoslavia, that he had become separated from the other 9 crew members, whose earlier exit put them down a few miles before him. He suspected they had made it to the ground okay, but he worried that they had been captured by Germans. It would be a long time before he found out his worries were justified, and he was the only one of his crew not taken prisoner right away. Getting trapped in his ball turret and the agonizing minutes it took to extricate himself while everyone else bailed out of the rapidly descending bomber, as terrifying as that was, turned out to be the saving grace for Musgrove. He wasn't in the clear, of course, and he was joining the hundreds of other airmen who escaped their planes and capture by the Nazis, only to find themselves in limbo, unsure of what would come next. It was getting dark when Musgrove entered the home with 3 other Americans, the group having been split up among several houses in the village. A rather robust woman, obviously the wife and mother, gestured for them to sit at the rough-hewn and well-worn wooden table, and then she started putting out some meager food rations for them, the same goat cheese, hard bread, and bits of rotting potatoes that they had seen in other villages. Though they were ravenous, the men tried not to rush as they ate. They knew already that it was a hardship for these people to feed them, and that their meal probably meant the couple, maybe even some children, would not eat tonight. They tried to eat with some decorum out of respect for the family's generosity, smiling and nodding thanks to the woman as she sat and watched. Just as Musgrove was choking down a last bit of dry bread, the door opened and a man entered, saying something to the woman, who responded and then stood up, leaving the room to the men. Musgrove and the other Americans nodded to the man as he entered and hung up his hat on a wooden peg, but they didn't say anything. They had gotten out of the habit of speaking to the locals in the past few days because no one could understand them. The man sat at the table with them and smiled in return as a couple of the Americans nodded and smiled, a gesture of thanks for the food, lifting a piece of bread or a cup of milk. "You are American?" he asked. The Americans were stunned and thrilled. They looked at one another and then back at the only Yugoslav they had met who could speak English. Yes, we're American," all 3 of them said together. The man introduced himself, but the name was a mash of consonants and vowels that the Americans could not catch. He asked if the men needed more food, but Musgrove and the other 2 men knew better than to say yes. Though they were still hungry, they could not ask this man to spare more of what little food he might have for his own family. In all their excitement to find someone who spoke English, the Americans were momentarily dumbfounded about what to say. The man across the table spoke instead. "I am principal of school," he said. "I study English." "A principal? Oh, okay," Musgrove said, nodding his head. After a pause, he continued. "Your English is very good." He spoke slowly in case the man's English actually wasn't so good. "Where are we?" The man responded with something in Yugoslav that, like his name, sounded like a jumble of consonants and vowels to the men. Besides, they weren't really concerned with the name of the village. They wanted to know what would happen to them. One of the other Americans spoke up. "Are we staying here? Did they bring us to you because you speak English?" "No," the man said. "You go to other place. You go to place with more Americans. They help you." Musgrove looked at the other Americans, puzzled. He turned back to the man. "They're taking us to Allied territory? Across the border?" he asked. The Americans knew that was unlikely. How could a bunch of hungry, injured, unarmed airmen get across the border and out of enemy territory? No, you go to place where more Americans. Here, Yugoslavia." Musgrove was still unsure what he meant. "You mean they're putting us all in one place? We're meeting up with more American airmen?" Yes, more like you. You go there, more Americans. You go there." Musgrove looked at the other 2 airmen, and all 3 slowly cracked smiles. There was a point to all this hiking from one village to another, after all. But they still didn't know exactly where "there" was, how long it would take, or what would happen when they got there. All efforts to pry more information out of the principal resulted only in him smiling and shrugging his shoulders to indicate that was the extent of what he could convey in English. "You go there. More Americans," was the most he could explain. Well, anything was better than just wandering like this, they thought. Let's hope there's a plan once we get there. Wherever there is. The villagers helping Musgrove and the other Americans get to their destination were risking their lives. If caught helping the downed American airmen, they would be killed just as the Germans had already killed thousands for resisting the Nazi invasion. German troops had been vicious when they overtook the country in 1941, brutalizing anyone seen as resisting the invasion and bombing the country into submission virtually overnight. In 1944, the country was firmly controlled by Germany, but as soon as the Nazi bombs had begun to fall 3 years earlier, those who had resisted the German invasion from the start had begun to fight back. The Germans may have rolled into Yugoslavia with little difficulty, but the Yugoslav people would not let them stay without a fight. These poor people in the Yugoslavian countryside were resisting in every way possible, from acts of sabotage and the occasional Nazi soldier who never returned from a visit to the hills to aiding every American airman they could find. After another week of walking through the Yugoslav countryside, sleeping in whatever village they could find or curled up in the bushes off the side of the road, Musgrove and the band of Americans were following their 2 armed escorts up yet another dirt road when they saw someone on horseback up ahead. They looked to the Yugoslav escorts for a reaction, ready to dive into the brush off the roadway and hide out until it was safe again. But the escorts were not concerned to see someone ahead and kept walking. The Americans assumed that the man on horseback was not German and might be someone the escorts knew, maybe an officer in their resistance. The group trudged along slowly. The fellow on horseback seemed to be waiting for them, and Musgrove grew more curious as they moved closer. Maybe this guy can speak some English, he thought. Sure would be good to find out where we are and where we're going. As they came closer, Musgrove could see that the man on horseback seemed to be a local, a brawny guy with a bushy beard, similar to many of the other men they had encountered along the way. The Americans looked to their escorts expectantly, thinking they would say something to the man, but instead they just stopped when the group approached him. Then the man on horseback spoke, and once again Musgrove was pleasantly surprised to hear English. "Hi, boys," the man said in a deep voice, using perfect English. "Welcome to Pranjane." It sounded like Pranjane. The Americans didn't know what to make of this. The man looked Yugoslav but spoke clear English. And was that a New York accent? The writer was George Mussolini, a special agent with the OSS, the elite group of spies and covert operatives that would later become the CIA, who had been dropped behind enemy lines to help the downed airmen. He and his team had been on the ground for a few weeks already, about as long as Musgrove, and they had news for the tired and hungry Americans. "You made it. You're here," he said. He looked down at the Americans as if he expected them to be happy with that, but Musgrove and his companions still didn't know where here was. "Where are we?" he asked. "What are we going to do here?" It was then that Mussolini realized the new arrivals hadn't been clued in yet. Some of the airmen arriving in Pranjane found out along the way about the plan, and others like this group showed up with no knowledge at all. "We're going to get you out of here, boys," Mussolini said, a smile showing through his bushy black beard. "There's going to be a rescue. There are already about 200 Americans here. They've been assembling since January." A rescue. Finally, some good news. Musgrove and the other airmen rejoiced, finding the energy to raise their arms and shout, clapping their Yugoslav escorts on the back and hugging one another. They would be rescued. They could go home. But how? C-47s, Mussolini said, referring to the workhorse cargo planes that every airman knew well. "They're going to land in a field right over there." Mussolini gestured off in the distance. "We've been working on a big plan that will get you boys out of here before long. Gotta build a landing strip, though." And with that, Mussolini turned his horse and trotted off. Musgrove and the others stood there in the road, joyous but a little puzzled too. To be sure they understood, one of their Yugoslav escorts raised his flat hand and moved it along like an airplane, making a buzzing sound. Musgrove and the other 2 Americans nodded at him. They understood the plan, but it sounded a little crazy to them. Build a landing strip? They certainly wanted to be rescued, but how could planes land in this mountainous region where they couldn't even walk down a country road without ducking into the bushes every time a vehicle passed, hoping they wouldn't be found by the Germans? The same questions were going through the mind of George Vujovic, the OSS control agent in Bari, Italy, with responsibility for sending secret agents on missions throughout much of Europe, including Yugoslavia. When Vujovic heard that there were American flyers waiting for help in Yugoslavia, he knew they had to come up with a plan to get them out. He also knew right away that this would be no ordinary rescue. Could they really pull this off? Could they go right into German territory and snatch these men out of harm's way? He had discussed the risks at length with Mussolini before sending him behind enemy lines, but even with Mussolini on the ground in Yugoslavia, the questions remained. It was more than his job duties that motivated Vujovic. He was driven by his own memories of being trapped behind enemy lines in Yugoslavia a few years earlier. He felt a kindred spirit with the Americans stranded in the country where his parents had grown up. The Pittsburgh native was attending college in Yugoslavia when his studies, and his fledgling relationship with a beautiful local girl, were interrupted by the rapidly advancing German army. 2 years of running from the Nazis, trying to find a way out of Yugoslavia and back to freedom, gave him a real appreciation for what these young airmen were going through. Vujovic was determined to get them out of their limbo. Could he make it happen? It hadn't been too difficult to send in Mussolini and the rest of his team, but getting more than 100 airmen out was a totally different matter. The plan, which the British were fighting vigorously, was to send in C-47 cargo planes to pick up the downed airmen and whisk them back to Italy. That was the plan. Just send in planes to pick them up. Allied planes flew over Yugoslavia all the time on the way to bomb targets in German territory, so it wasn't far-fetched to think that one could drop down and pick up a few airmen. It sounded simple until Vujovic started trying to work out the details. Already Mussolini's team had radioed back that there were far more airmen to rescue than the 150 that they'd expected when they parachuted in to coordinate the pickup. Mussolini's last message had informed Vujovic that there were at least 200 men there already, and more were coming in every day, sometimes a dozen or more at a time. That meant the mission was growing exponentially harder every day, Vujovic realized. It was not simply a matter of sending in a few planes to swoop down and snatch the men in a hurry. Rescuing that many airmen would require a series of planes landing one after another. More planes meant more of a spectacle for the Germans to notice, and much more time when the planes and the airmen would be easy targets for German fighters or ground troops. And the more he thought about it, the more Vujovic worried that sending in any planes, even one, to this area was extremely risky. He knew the area was rugged and mountainous, with no airstrip nearby, and not even a clear field that could serve as a runway in a pinch. That was why all the bomber crews bailed out when their planes were dying in this area. There was nowhere to even attempt a crash landing. The best they could hope for was to jump out and hang under a parachute as they watched the plane crash into a mountainside. Now Vujovic was trying to organize not just one, but a whole series of cargo planes to land in that rugged countryside, right under the Germans' noses. It was an audacious plan, and some in the office weren't shy about telling Vujovic that it was more than that it was just plain crazy. But Vujovic kept thinking about all the young men trapped in Nazi territory, struggling to get through another day without being captured, and hoping that someone was working on a way to get them out. He could identify with them. He could remember the cold terror that gripped his whole body as he held his breath and hoped a German patrol would pass by the young American and the girl he loved, the desperation of wanting to just get out of danger, to just get over the border, to get back home. Claire Musgrove ended up in Yugoslavia in the same way hundreds of other Allied airmen had in the few years before him, and as many more would after him. He climbed into a bomber in Italy, flew into Nazi territory to bomb critical oil refineries and other targets, and never made it back to the safety of his home base. Every time a fleet of bombers went out, some were heavily damaged by German defenses and either went down immediately or limped back toward Italy, trying to make it as far as they could. By 1944, downed American airmen were piling up quickly in Yugoslavia as bombing raids on Nazi targets, especially the oil refineries of Ploiești, Romania, resulted in many planes making it only that far on their return journey before the crews had to bail out and try to survive behind enemy lines. The quest to destroy Ploiești would leave hundreds of airmen stranded in the hills of Yugoslavia. To get to Romania, the Allied bomber crews had to fly westward, usually from bases in the recently liberated Italy, across the Adriatic Sea, then across Yugoslavia to their targets in Romania. Then they had to get back again, often limping home with planes and crew injured from the intense fighting at the target site. Romania was a top target because it represented one of the westward strongholds of the German military, and particularly because it was the major source of fuel for the German war machine. The country was smaller than the state of Oregon and had little chance of resisting the Germans, though it took a shot at staying neutral. Hitler, of course, saw pleas for neutrality as a sign of weakness and rolled into the country. Romania was in an untenable situation, perched between German advances in Poland and Hungary and Soviet advances from the Ukraine. In June 1941, Romania officially joined the Axis, primarily in hopes of regaining some provinces that it had previously been forced to give up. Though Romania had fought Germany in the First World War, the country allied itself with the Nazis strictly as a desperate measure for self-preservation. Romania's pact with the devil would be costly, however. It was no surprise that once the country joined the German rampage across Europe, Britain declared war on Romania on December 5, 1941. On June 5, 1942, the United States extended its declaration of war on Germany and Italy to include Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Before long, the same resource that had made Romania so desirable to the German war machine, massive oil fields and high-capacity refineries, made it a prime target for the Allies. American bomber crews who had barely heard of Romania months before soon learned all about a Romanian city called Ploiești, an oil boom city in the plains below the Transylvanian Alps in northern Romania and 35 miles north of Bucharest, the national capital. Ploiești was a massive complex consisting of 7 major refineries, storage tanks, and related structures covering 19 square miles. Oil refining had been big business in Ploiești since 1857, which means the city was one of the first to build riches on the resource that would dominate the world's economy within decades. By 1942, the refineries at Ploiești were producing nearly 1 million tons of oil a month, accounting for 40% of Romania's total exports. Most of that oil, as well as the highest quality 90-octane aviation fuel in Europe, went to the Axis war effort. Ploiești, a prosperous but otherwise little-known city in a quiet country before the war, suddenly became a central component of the Nazi military, key to everything Hitler wanted to accomplish. The refineries of Ploiești provided nearly a third of the petroleum products that fueled Hitler's tanks, battleships, submarines, and aircraft. The Allies had to put Ploiești out of the oil refining business, and they were willing to risk as many lives as necessary to do it. The Germans were just as determined to protect this vital supply of oil, and they installed an astonishing array of anti-aircraft guns all around the refineries for miles and miles. Some of the best German fighter pilots were stationed at airfields around Ploiești, with orders to protect the refineries from Allied bombers. Ploiești was the first target in Europe bombed by American aircraft. Many more attacks would follow the first. The honor of hitting Ploiești first went to Colonel Harry A. Halverson in May 1942. He led 23 factory-fresh B-24 bombers from Florida on a journey to bomb Tokyo in a follow-up to the Doolittle Raid, the daring assault on the Japanese homeland that was carried out as retribution for the attack on Pearl Harbor. But when the bombers reached Egypt, Halverson and his crews were informed that they had a new destination, Ploiești. The planes took off for their new target on the evening of June 11th, arriving over the target at dawn the following day. The mission was a success. 10 of the bombers hit the Astra refinery at Ploiești, 1 B-24 attacked the port area of Constanta, and the remaining 2 B-24s struck unidentified targets. Damage to the planes was minimal. The first bombing run caused substantial damage, but it was clear to the Allies that many more young men would have to risk their lives to keep the refineries offline. Bombing runs continued, and then in August 1943, the Allies launched Operation Tidal Wave, intended as an all-out effort against Ploesti. Unlike previous attacks that had been made from thousands of feet in the air, Operation Tidal Wave called for striking the oil fields at very low levels, treetop level sometimes, so low that the exploding bombs and oil fires actually threatened the planes. And then, of course, there was the problem of a B-24 bomber making a very big, very easy target at that altitude. The extreme risk required that the plan be approved all the way up the chain of command, with even President Franklin D. Roosevelt agonizing over whether the need to knock out Ploesti justified the extreme risk to the air crews. He decided that it did, and the bomber crews were given terrifying orders. The increased danger called for more than the usual mission preparation. The low-level raids on Ploesti were practiced on a full-scale replica of Ploesti built in the desert. The crews had to perfect their navigation skills and fly in strict radio silence if there was any hope of reaching their target without being shot down. Getting back home was even tougher, and more of an afterthought in the training. 177 B-24s took off in Operation Tidal Wave on August 1, 1943, a huge wave of bombers that filled the sky but nevertheless intended to sneak into Ploesti. The extensive planning did not ensure success. Things went badly right from the start as one B-24 crashed on takeoff. The strict radio silence caused the bomber groups to become separated on the long flight across the Adriatic. And then when the planes neared Corfu, Greece, the lead aircraft, the one carrying the route navigator that was to lead the whole group into Ploesti, suddenly dove into the water for no apparent reason. Another plane, this one carrying the backup route navigator, circled down to check for survivors, but lost so much time doing so that it couldn't catch up with the formation. So it turned back to base, leaving the lead bomber group with no expert navigators to lead it on this extremely dangerous low-level approach to Ploesti. The planes continued on anyway, the importance of their mission having been drilled into them. They met thick cloud cover as they approached the mountains around Ploesti, and the various bomber groups making up the overall attack chose different paths through the clouds. The two lead bomber groups carefully made their way through or under the clouds, while the three other groups climbed over them. The high-flying bombers took a while to get back down, and by then they were half an hour behind the others. The carefully choreographed mission was falling apart. As they approached Ploesti, the crews were looking for waypoints to mark their path, especially other towns they could recognize from the air. One of the bomber groushed for Florești, an error that went undiscovered until it led them to the outskirts of Bucharest, way off target. At that point, the crews realized there was little hope of carrying out the attack they had practiced for so long. They broke radio silence and turned north to attack the complex of refineries in Ploesti as best they could. "Hit anything you can," they told one another. "Just find a target and drop your bombs." German fighters attacked the bombers, which did their best to pick out high-value targets and bomb them at very low altitude, as planned. The fighters pursued the bombers as they left Ploesti, shooting down 54 planes, each with a crew of 10 or 12 men. Another 53 planes were heavily damaged. Though reconnaissance flights confirmed that the damage to Ploesti was significant, it was a costly victory. Allied bombers would continue hitting Ploesti over and over again until August 19, 1944. Every bomber that left from an Allied base to bomb Ploesti carried up to a dozen young men like Claire Musgrove. Some of them would die before they ever reached their target. Many would die as they reached the target and met withering anti-aircraft fire and attacks from German fighter planes, and others would make it through the worst of the fighting only to find themselves in a crippled, rapidly dying airplane that would not make it back to base. The bombing runs were always harrowing and violent, with every successful return seeming like a triumph over fate. Musgrove was typical of the bomber crews that flew these critical missions, wondering each time he climbed into the plane if he would make it back alive. Growing up in Hersey, Michigan, a small community north of Grand Rapids, Musgrove never imagined he would be flying missions that were so important to the Allied war effort and that could kill him every time. One of 4 children, Musgrove had spent much of his childhood helping his grandparents on their small 25-cow dairy farm and graduated from high school in 1937. He then went to a local community college and spent 4 years teaching in rural schools, which he enjoyed but knew he would not make his life's work. Instead, Musgrove looked to the military for a better career, one that might offer more adventure than he saw in central Michigan. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Musgrove knew his path was clear. America had been at war in Europe for about 6 months in 1942 when, at age 22, Musgrove volunteered for the Air Force because he wanted to fly. Most of his former classmates and most of his friends were volunteering also. Everyone wanted to fly because it was the glamorous way to serve in the military. The recruiting posters showed handsome young men in flight suits and leather caps heading off for grand escapades that outshone anything in a schoolteacher's life, so that was the choice for Musgrove. Unfortunately, Musgrove ran into the same roadblock that stymied many young men's aspirations for flight. He couldn't pass the eye test. Musgrove's less-than-perfect depth perception meant the government wasn't going to put him in the pilot's seat, but hey, there are plenty of other seats on those big bombers, the Air Force pointed out. Musgrove could still fly if he found another position, so he considered navigator, radio operator, and engineer. But the one that sounded best was aerial gunner. The Air Force obliged and transferred him from Shepherd Field, near Wichita Falls, Texas, where he had undergone basic training, to Laredo, Texas, on Rio Grande River at the border with Mexico. This was the site of the Air Force's first aerial gunner school, and Musgrove excelled at his work so much that he was tapped to stay on as an instructor in how to use the ball turret gun on a B-24 bomber. Having already gotten his fill of teaching before joining the service, Musgrove taught for a year before becoming restless as he watched other, less experienced men go off to war. He lobbied for an assignment to active duty, and the Air Force relented, sending him overseas to the 15th Air Force stationed in Italy. Musgrove still didn't leave his teaching role, however. The Air Force assigned him to be the instructor for ball turret gunners with the 15th Air Force, reinforcing what the newly arriving crew members had been taught stateside and helping them hone their skills for life-or-death missions over Europe. And there were always plenty of new recruits to bring up to speed. Every time a plane went off on a bombing mission and came back loaded with dead and dying crewmen who lost their fight with a storm of shrapnel, or when a plane never returned at all, that meant more young men had to be brought in as replacements. Musgrove stayed busy teaching the new ball turret gunners how to protect their bombers and how to stay alive. Neither was an easy task for someone hanging in a plexiglass sphere from the belly of a bomber. Nobody really wanted to be in a ball turret. This plexiglass ball hanging from the bottom of the bomber was one of America's latest innovations in warfare. An ingenious piece of machinery built by the Sperry Corporation, the ball turret was a heavily armed bubble just big enough to hold a grown man, but only one on the small side. It had room for the gunner and its 2 50-caliber machine guns, and little else. The extremely cramped quarters meant that the gunner was the only crew member on a bomber who did not wear a parachute during the mission. His was left sitting up in the main part of the plane, where he would have to go get it and put it on before escaping with the rest of the crew. Musgrove always told his students, "Stow your chute where you can find it in a hurry. You won't have much time." The ball turret was not a place for the claustrophobic. It was a tiny space, though it had a great view of the scenery below, or the fighter planes coming up to kill you. The entire unit rotated around in a circle and also up and down, so that the gunner could fire on planes coming from any direction. Being suspended underneath the plane gave the gunner a sensation of flying free, and that often meant that the attacking fighters seemed to be going after him personally rather than trying to shoot down the bomber itself. Everyone on the plane was riding an adrenaline surge during a fighter attack, but none more so than the ball turret gunner who was furiously firing his 50-caliber machine guns at the German plane, trying to kill him in his little glass bubble. The ball turret gunner sat curled up in a fetal position, swiveling the entire turret as he aimed the two guns. As he moved the turret quickly to find attacking planes, and then follow them with his guns, the gunner could be in any position from lying on his back to standing on his feet. The gunner sat between the guns, his feet in stirrups positioned on either side of a 13-inch diameter window in front, his knees up around his ears, and very little room for moving anything but his hands. His flight suit provided the only padding for comfort. An optical gun sight hung in front of his face, and a pedal under his left foot adjusted a reticule on the gun sight glass. When the target was framed in the sight, the gunner knew the range was correct, and he let fly with the machine guns, pushing down on the two firing buttons located on the wooden handles that also controlled the movement of the ball. Shell casings were ejected through a port just below the gun barrel, pouring out as fast as the beads of sweat on the gunner's face. The plane carried 250 rounds of ammunition per gun for the ball turret, fed down from boxes mounted on either side of the hoist. The ball turret in the B-24, which Musgrove flew, was electrically raised and lowered, unlike those in the B-17 bombers, which had to be manually cranked up into the fuselage. Musgrove thought this was a great improvement over the B-17 design, because no one wanted to be trapped in a ball turret. There was no way to exit the turret without raising it into the fuselage of the plane, so a turret that could not be retracted was a death trap for the gunner. Any system that made it faster and easier to retract the turret was welcomed by the gunners. They had all heard the stories of ball turret gunners who were trapped in their glass bubbles when battle damage prevented them being retracted into the fuselage. Not only was the gunner left out there with no protection, probably with his guns empty or inoperable, but he also faced the prospect of the big plane landing with him hanging from the belly. It was every ball turret gunner's nightmare, and it became a horrifying reality for some. If the gunner was already dead in the turret and it could not be retracted into the plane, the crew sometimes would jettison the whole apparatus because the plane was not designed to land with the ball turret hanging underneath. But if the gunner was alive, they would have to tell him that they had no choice but to put the plane down eventually. The ball turret gunner had a long time to contemplate his fate, maybe to say goodbye on the intercom to his crewmates as the damaged plane limped back to base or looked for a field in which to crash. All he could do was sit in the glass bubble like a helpless fetus in the womb, watching the ground come up closer and closer. When the plane landed, the ball turret was scraped off the belly, taking the gunner with it. Musgrove knew the risks, and he had heard all the terrible stories about how ball turret gunners died. But he wanted to fly missions, not just teach others how to risk their own lives. His superiors agreed to let him fly missions as long as his main priority remained, teaching the new crew members who were streaming in all the time. That meant Musgrove couldn't be teamed up with one flight crew that always went out on missions together, as most of the crew members did. Instead, he would rotate through the different flight crews to fill in for ball turret gunners who were out of action that day or whose replacements had not yet been assigned. Musgrove never knew when he was going to fly and when he was going to stay at the base and watch the planes leave on their bombing missions. Less than 2 weeks shy of his 25th birthday, he had been on 8 missions already, bombing power plants and railroad junctions and participating in the invasion of southern France. And he had seen a fair share of heavy-duty combat from his position in the ball turret. He was sleeping soundly when, on the morning of July 28, 1944, an officer came to his bunk and woke him up much earlier than he had planned. "Get ready to fly. Be at the briefing by 0430, the officer said, pausing only briefly to make sure Musgrove was awake and then turning to leave. When Musgrove made his way to the briefing with a dozen other bleary-eyed men, he found out that he was flying on a mission to Ploesti. The briefing officer explained that a number of bombers would be flying directly over the main production areas of the Ploesti oil fields. "It's a very hot target area, well protected by the Germans," the officer explained. "This target's been hit almost daily for about 10 days, and we're trying to eliminate this last energy source for the Germans. They're desperate to protect it, so you can expect a lot of resistance, but you're the best damn bomber crews in the Air Force, so they've got a real fight coming. Despite the somber warning about how tough the mission would be, the young airmen left the briefing feeling elated and eager to get underway. At dawn, Musgrove climbed into a B-24 with 9 other men and found a position near the tail gunner for takeoff. In addition to Musgrove, the B-24 carried a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and a bombardier, all officers. The crew also included an airplane mechanic, who operated the top turret located above the cockpit, and a radio operator who manned the nose turret when he wasn't on the radio. 2 wing gunners manned the big 50 caliber machine guns on either side of the fuselage, and the tail gunner protected the rear of the plane. Because the ball turret gunner didn't lower the ball until after takeoff, he was the only crew member who was away from his assigned position when the plane sped down the runway, and because Musgrove was a floater who flew with whatever crew needed him, he was the only member of this crew that had not flown with the others on previous missions. He was welcomed, and the rest of the crew were glad to have a talented gunner on board. But Musgrove knew he was not part of this plane's tight-knit brotherhood, a bond that forms naturally when men fly into danger together over and over. This crew had been in Italy for only a short time, and they were going out on their 3rd mission. But Musgrove knew they had trained and flown together, so they were a family, and he was a stranger to them. "All right, boys, let's go show 'em what we got," the pilot called out over the intercom as the plane taxied for takeoff. Musgrove and the other crew responded with a hearty yell. 36 B-24 bombers from bases all over Italy formed up for this mission to Ploesti. Musgrove and the other crew members were mostly lost in their own thoughts as they flew 4 hours to the oil refineries in Ploesti, the unmuffled noise of the plane combining with the rushing wind to make conversation difficult without using the intercom. They each sat at their stations, going through checklists and confirming operational details with one another, sharing a bit of dark humor here and there about their prospects of returning from the mission. They all knew that each mission could be their last. But despite the looming threat of death, the men were not overtly scared or apprehensive. They were excited, eager to do the job they were trained for, to accomplish the task they knew was so important for the Allied war effort. Like the rest of the young men on the B-24, Musgrove wanted to get the job done, return, and celebrate a successful mission. Musgrove was trying to stay warm as the plane climbed higher and higher, soon putting on a flight suit over his summer khakis when the air became colder and colder. By the time the plane reached 22,000 feet, Musgrove had already plugged his flight suit into an electrical port that allowed the garment to heat up like an electric blanket. After a few minutes, the suit was warm enough that he could forget the bone-chilling cold wind rushing through the plane. As they crossed over into enemy territory, Musgrove heard the pilot call out to him on the intercom, "Ball turret gunner, take your position." That was his signal that it was time to leave the interior of the plane and drop down underneath it. He unplugged his flight suit from the port in the plane and stuffed himself into the ball turret so that his knees were almost up around his ears. Then he used the electro-hydraulic controls to lower it into position beneath the plane. Once he was in position, Musgrove gripped the handles to maneuver the turret fully through its rotations and test the movement of the guns, ensuring that the turret was ready for action as soon as German planes showed up. Once he was satisfied that everything was in order, Musgrove plugged his suit back into the warming port and settled in. There was nothing for him to do but sit and wait for the inevitable leg cramps and the itch you couldn't reach. He rode another couple of hours toward Ploesti, scanning the skies all around the bomber for any sign of German fighters as the formation descended down to 10,000 feet. The planes made it nearly all the way to the target without being intercepted, but then Musgrove could see that the Germans were well aware of their arrival. The sky ahead of the bomber was already filled with the inky black bursts of anti-aircraft fire. The flak over the target rattled Musgrove like a piñata, the explosive concussions shaking the plane hard and bouncing him around in the tight confines of the turret bubble. With every booming blast, Musgrove waited for the one piece of red-hot shrapnel that could come flying through the plexiglass and kill him like so many other ball turret gunners. That piece of shell casing never came, and the plane flew on through the inky black clouds left by the explosions. After what seemed an eternity, as any flight did when flak was exploding all around you. Musgrove saw the bombs fall and felt the lightened plane rise higher in the air. Musgrove began to breathe a bit easier after the bombs were away and the plane pulled away from the target, but once the immediate danger died down a bit, Musgrove could hear the telltale sounds of a sputtering B-24 engine. The plane had been hit by the flak, and Musgrove could tell right away that the damage was serious. He heard what he thought was first one and then two of the plane's 4 engines coughing and sputtering, sounds that were disturbingly different from the incessant drone that the crew listened to for hours on end when flying. The open intercom line allowed the entire crew to hear the pilot and co-pilot talking, so Musgrove followed the play-by-play as they dealt with the damaged engines. "Engine 2, losing power," the co-pilot shouted. "Engine 3's going. We got hit bad." And then he heard the 2 troubled engines shut down. First Engine 2 stopped struggling, and then Engine 3. Both inside engines were dead. The sudden end to the noise was even more troubling than the rough engine sounds. Musgrove listened as the pilots throttled up the other 2 engines to compensate and try to keep the plane aloft. The plane stayed in the air, but on only 2 engines it was too slow to keep up with the formation as all the surviving planes turned away from Ploesti and started their journeys home. From his position in the ball turret, Musgrove could see that his B-24 was dropping out of formation. Then he watched as the dozens of other B-24s flew on toward Italy, leaving Musgrove's plane to limp along behind. The plane could make it back on just 2 engines, Musgrove knew. He'd seen plenty of planes come struggling back to the base on 2 engines. They just showed up a lot later than everyone else. The real danger came from being alone in the sky, with dozens of bombers flying in formation, each of them loaded with 50 caliber machine guns. There was safety in numbers. Fighter planes attacking the formation had to get through not just one plane's defenses, but several. Now Musgrove and the rest of his crew were on their own. If a German fighter found the lame duck, defending the bomber would be much more difficult. Musgrove was sweating in his flight suit now and unplugged the heating port. He moved the ball turret around in all directions again, making sure it was ready if a fighter appeared. He had not yet fired a single shot that day because German fighters never came up to greet them. Musgrove listened in as the B-24 pilot called on the radio for a fighter escort to help them make it back without being torn to shreds by a German attack, and then it was only about 10 minutes before 2 P-51 Mustangs came alongside to offer protection, diving down from where they and other Mustangs had been providing cover for the entire formation during the bombing run. The other fighters remained with the faster-moving pack of bombers in formation. Musgrove was glad to see the sleek fighters and gave the pilots a wave as they took up positions on either side of the slow, lumbering bomber. He kept his hands on the ball turret controls, ready if a German fighter thought the slow plane made a good target. After a short while, Musgrove could see that the plane was steadily losing altitude. He could hear the pilots talking about losing power and trying different strategies to keep the plane up, but it was clear to him that the plane was not going to make it back to Italy. Then the pilot made an announcement to the crew. "Hey guys, I don't think we're going to make it back to our base," the pilot said calmly. "We just don't have the energy to get back over the mountains." He didn't say anything else, but the crew knew what he meant. Get ready to bail out. It won't be long. A few minutes later, the navigator came on the intercom and told the crew that the plane was approaching the Bulgarian-Yugoslavian border. Thanks for the information, Musgrove thought, but it doesn't help me much. Where on the border? Where are we going down? It was about 11 a.m. when the pilot came on again. "We're going to have to get ready to abandon ship because we're just not going to make it," he said, sounding more tense than before. Musgrove's stomach came up into his mouth as he heard the words, "abandon ship." Like the rest of the crew, he had been trained in the procedures but hoped he would never have to jump out of a B-24. The very idea sickened him, the thought of jumping into the unknown when you thought you would be sleeping in your own bunk again that night. "Okay, "We've gone as far as we can go. We better bail out," the pilot said, hitting the switch for the bailout bell, an alarm no flyer wanted to hear. The words seemed to pound in Musgrove's ears through the intercom headset. "Everybody bail out! Bail out!" The bailout bell rang incessantly as the rest of the crew started double-checking their parachute harnesses and then making their way to a side door in the fuselage and throwing themselves out. Musgrove first had to get out of the ball turret, so he hit the switch to raise it up into the plane and climb out. Nothing happened. He hit the switch again. Nothing. He hit the damn thing over and over, harder and harder, and still the turret didn't move. He was trapped. Musgrove called out on the intercom, "I've got no power. No power. I can't get up." There was no reply. The rest of the crew were bailing out already, and besides, Musgrove knew there was nothing the crew could do for him anyway. He was on his own. Musgrove realized he had to use the backup method for raising the turret, a hand crank that relied on pure muscle and a few gears to lift the heavy mechanism up into the fuselage. He had taught his students this lesson 1,000 times, and now it was his turn to put it to use. Musgrove wasted no time grabbing the crank and furiously winding. He could feel the turret moving, but he was sure the ground was coming up faster. Musgrove's adrenaline surged, and sweat poured off his face as he cranked as hard and as fast as he could in the cramped bubble, his heart pounding so vigorously he felt it throbbing in his eardrums. "I've got to get out! I've got to get out before I'm too low for my chute to work." Musgrove cranked the handle for almost 10 minutes, his wide eyes focused intently on the landscape below, trying to gauge how low the plane was getting. Finally, with his arms searing from the work, the turret was up in the fuselage far enough for Musgrove to get out. He furiously undid the latches and scrambled out of the hatch, crawling out backwards. He stood up quickly and looked around, but he was all alone. There was no one else on the bomber with Musgrove. In the 10 minutes it took him to get back up into the plane, they had all successfully abandoned ship, even the pilots who customarily were the last out. They knew it would take Musgrove a while, and they couldn't do anything to help, so they wisely left without him. Musgrove was eager to follow them, so he went to the spot where he had stowed his parachute at the beginning of the flight, in a corner of the fuselage framing just behind the ball turret. It wasn't there. The rough flight and flak concussions over Ploesti had bounced the plane around so much that Musgrove's parachute wasn't where he left it. It took a panic-filled moment to look around and find it. Then Musgrove quickly attached it to the parachute harness he already wore. With the parachute in place, Musgrove went to a side door and looked out. The plane was getting lower all the time, but he thought it was still high enough for his chute to work. He got down on his knees, as he had been trained, and rolled out into the rushing wind. After waiting as long as he could stand, to ensure he was clear of the plane, Musgrove pulled the ripcord on his parachute and braced for the sharp jerk on his harness. He had already winced in anticipation when he realized nothing was happening. He looked down to make sure he had really pulled the ripcord, and, sure enough, there was the thing clenched tightly in his hand. His chute wasn't opening. Furiously, as fast as he could while in a free fall from about 10,000 feet high, Musgrove reached into the parachute pack and dug out the cloth with his own hands. He grabbed the soft silk and pulled over and over until a pocket of the cloth caught the air and the rest exploded out above him. The young men parachuting into the hills of Yugoslavia had no idea what awaited them. They knew only that this was their last chance to live when their bomber was on fire, or the engines went out, or they had lost too much fuel from shrapnel on their bombing runs over Romania. Some, like Musgrove, made several death-defying missions before they were forced to get out of their crashing planes, while others, like 21-year-old Tony Orsini, had to bail out of his bomber on his first mission. Orsini had been in Italy for only a week when he was assigned to his first bombing mission over Ploesti. A navigator, Orsini had guided a B-24 from Lincoln, Nebraska, across the Atlantic Ocean and up the coast of Africa. The crew of Greenhorns reported to an Air Force base in southern Italy named Grottagle as part of the 716th Squadron of the 449th Bomb Group. Orsini had been there for only a few days, waiting for more orientation and local maps, when he was awakened at 4 a.m. on July 21, 1944, by someone shouting, "Briefing at 600." At the briefing, Orsini learned he had been assigned to fly a mission with a more experienced crew. They would be bombing the Ploesti oil refineries. In addition to all the usual information about the target, the bomb loads, the route, and what resistance to expect, the officer briefing the crew gave them a curious warning, one they had never heard before. "You're going to be flying over Yugoslavia. If you have to bail out, avoid the Chetniks. They're the followers of General Mihailovich," the officer said sternly. "Seek out the partisans. They're the followers of General Tito." The advice was completely wrong, but the officer believed it and was trying to be helpful. It would be years before the source of the misinformation became clear. But at the moment, Orsini didn't give it much thought anyway. Orsini had heard only the sketchiest information about the ongoing civil war in Yugoslavia and the two factions that were fighting for control of the country while simultaneously fending off the Germans who occupied their land. He took note of the warning, but gave it much lower priority than everything else he had heard that morning. This was Orsini's very first mission, and the rest of the crew would be depending on him to navigate their B-24 skillfully. He didn't want to miss anything. Orsini was scared to death as the plane neared its target in Romania. He tried to focus on the maps on his small desk in the plane, checking and double-checking everything he could think of, but he was terrified by the thought of the air defenses around Ploesti. When his map coordinates showed that they were nearing the oil fields, Orsini looked out a window and saw his fears take form. The sky was filled with exploding shells, the shrapnel tearing through anything in its path, aluminum, steel, or flesh. German fighter planes were zooming through the bomber formation, strafing planes as they held their course and attempted to drop their loads on the target. Orsini was waiting to hear the bombardier call out, "Bombs away!" over the intercom, because that would mean their work was done, and the pilots could hightail it out of that god-awful mess. After what seemed an eternity, with explosions booming all around and buffeting the plane back and forth, Orsini heard the bombardier's call, and almost immediately after, he felt the plane shudder violently, a sensation he hadn't felt before. He knew right away that the bomber had taken a direct hit from the anti-aircraft fire. The explosion knocked the B-24 out of formation, and the pilots struggled to maintain level flight as 2 of the 4 engines died. Just as with Musgrove's crippled bomber, the crew of Orsini's plane worried that a German fighter would find them separated from the protection of the pack, flying slow and low. Every so often the pilot would ask Orsini, who had been carefully plotting the plane's progress, for an update on whether they could make it back to Italy at this speed and fuel consumption. Each time Orsini replied that it would be close, but they could probably make it. A couple of hours went by that way, the plane slowly losing altitude and the crew deathly silent as they prayed for a good outcome and watched the skies intently for German planes. The quiet was broken when the tail gunner's voice came on the intercom. "Fighters at 6 o'clock!" he screamed, indicating the sky behind the plane. "Fighters at 6 o'clock!" The gunners all tensed and prepared to fight off the attack, but then the tail gunner came back on the intercom about 30 seconds later and said, "They're P-38s. It's okay." P-38s were American fighters, and these had spotted the B-24 limping home. They flew in alongside and escorted the B-24 as it continued descending, eventually reaching 10,000 feet, far lower than the 21,000 feet where it had dropped its bombs. At that point, the pilot turned back to Orsini and asked him for a final assessment of whether they were going to make it back if they continued descending at that rate. "No, sir," Orsini answered. "There's no way." The continuing rate of descent had removed any optimism. The pilot was prepared for that answer and immediately called out on the intercom, "Abandon ship! Abandon ship! I repeat, abandon ship!" Orsini wasn't surprised because he had contemplated that possibility for the past hour, and he knew the pilot was making the right decision. Better to bail out now instead of waiting until they were over the Adriatic Sea. The bailout bell was almost a welcome sound by then. The only problem was that Orsini didn't know exactly where they were. He could tell from his calculations that they wouldn't make it back, but he was missing several key maps that would have told him what region they were about to jump into. When he realized at the morning briefing that he was missing the designated maps, he had asked an officer for them. But the officer dismissed him, telling him not to worry because his plane would be number 4 in the formation and he only had to play follow the leader. Now Orsini was frustrated that he couldn't give the crew any idea what they were jumping into. He had some idea that they were over Serbia, but he didn't know they were in a very mountainous region called Ravna Gora. As Orsini prepared to jump out of the ailing plane, he suddenly wished he had taken better care of his parachute. Since it was issued to him nearly 6 months earlier, he had tossed it around nonchalantly, using it for a pillow and a football on more than one occasion. Now his life would depend on that chute opening. He had been trained to count 1001, 1002, 1003 before pulling the ripcord, but Orsini was so anxious about whether the abused parachute would work that he couldn't wait. He yanked the ripcord immediately and was relieved to see the canopy snap to attention over his head. After the brutal yank of the chute on his harness, everything became surreal. The sky was so quiet, with just a soft whisper of wind passing his ears. Orsini had been in the loud plane for hours, the constant rumble of the engines overshadowed only by the deafening booms of the anti-aircraft fire. The sudden silence was unsettling. Orsini felt like he was suspended in space, as if he were not descending at all but just swaying back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The sensation, along with all the fear and dread that gripped him for hours already, caused him to vomit on the way down. A navigator like Orsini, Robert Wilson knew it was practically inevitable that he would be shot down eventually. He was a navigator on B-17 bombers, similar to B-24s, and he was specially trained in a new type of radar that enabled the Allies to bomb the Ploesti oil fields even when there was heavy cloud cover or smoke. Normally, the bombing runs had to be delayed or canceled when the cloud cover or smoke was too heavy, or else the bombardiers would just be taking a wild guess at where they were dumping all that firepower. The Allies did not indiscriminately drop bombs, so the planes would divert to another target that they could see. The Germans knew this and installed giant smoke pots all around Ploesti, creating black clouds that effectively obscured the target on some days. But with the system Wilson used, the planes could still find their targets no matter how obscured they were. Wilson had grown up in Peoria, Illinois, and had completed 1 semester of college when, at age 19, he signed up for the Air Corps, attracted by the glamour of flying like so many others. And like many others, he was cut from pilot training. He went to navigation school instead and completed his training in December 1943. B-17 crews trained as a unit, but when Wilson's crew graduated, they didn't immediately go to active duty like their classmates. Instead, they were sent for secret training on the new equipment that required Wilson to be looking for the target on his equipment at the same time the bombardier was looking for the target visually with the Norden bomb sight. If the bombardier couldn't see the target, Wilson released the bombs based on his readings. The radar system improved the effectiveness of the Ploesti bombing runs. However, the Air Force didn't have many of these new units. There was only one in the region around Italy where Wilson was based, so it was used as much as possible. The other problem was that the one B-17 with that radar unit, and Wilson operating it, had to be at the front of the pack of bombers every time it flew. Normally, the many flight crews took turns as the lead plane because that was considered the most dangerous spot in the formation, and the pilots had to work much harder to manage the formation and get the bombers to the target. With enough crews rotating, nobody had to put themselves at the head of the pack too often. But when the mission depended on the radar unit finding the target, Wilson's plane had to be at the front so it could drop its bombs first. Seeing the bombs away on Wilson's plane was the signal for all the other bombers to drop theirs. When they got to their base in Italy to begin active duty, the rest of the crew that Wilson had trained with was assigned to another B-17, and they rotated through the front position like everyone else. But not Wilson. He was permanently attached to the one plane that housed the radar unit, and a different crew was slotted to fly that plane at the lead on every mission. For the other 9 crew members on board, it was just their unlucky day to be in the most dangerous position. For Wilson, it was every mission. In July 1944, with 20 missions under his belt already, Wilson was one of the more experienced flyers in his unit. But he knew that every time he climbed into the B-17 again, he was pressing his luck. How many times could he fly into danger at the head of the formation and make it back to the base? He found out on his 21st mission. It was July 15, 1944, and Wilson was making his 3rd trip to Ploesti. As he had 20 times before, Wilson braced himself for the long, uncomfortable ride to the target, bundling up as the plane climbed into the high-altitude chill, donning his oxygen mask at 12,000 feet, and then a steel helmet and bulky, chafing flak vest as the plane neared the target. It was standard on these flights for each crew member to be extremely uncomfortable for as long as 9 hours, cold, sweaty, with gear rubbing the wrong way, the griping in your head momentarily taking your mind off the fact that you might die very shortly. When the B-17 approached the target at Ploesti, the pilot put the plane on a form of automatic pilot that shifted control to the bombardier, and in this case, to Wilson also. They would fly the plane, making minor course adjustments to get the plane on target, and then release the bombs. As the outskirts of Ploesti came into view, Wilson could see that the refinery they were hitting that day, Romana Americana, was covered by smoke. He knew he would be dropping the bombs on this mission. As soon as Wilson called, "Bombs away," he felt a direct hit on the left wing, and then the 2 engines on that side sputtered to a stop. About the same time, Wilson heard someone calling over the intercom. "Larry's hit!" someone yelled urgently, referring to Lawrence Norton, the engineer. "He got it in the head." Wilson ran forward from his station to see about Norton and found the young man dazed, with blood streaking down his face. Norton was leaning against a support frame in the plane as Wilson took a look at his injury, trying not to react too strongly as he saw the large piece of jagged shrapnel sticking out of the man's head, right on top. The still hot piece of an exploding anti-aircraft shell had come through the fuselage of the plane, penetrated Norton's steel helmet, and embedded itself deeply in his head. The wound was not bleeding profusely, but it left Norton semi-conscious. Wilson and another crew member applied a dressing to the wound and helped Norton sit down. Then they gave him a dose of morphine from one of their escape kits, opening his warm flight suit to press the syringe into his upper arm, but there was little time to fret about their injured crewmate. There was more trouble. The anti-aircraft fire had severed the fuel tank in that wing also, and Wilson looked up from his radar station to see gasoline pouring into the fuselage from the broken lines. The fumes from the fuel started filling the fuselage, burning Wilson's eyes, and in moments the crew members were standing in 2 inches of gasoline. Wilson and every other man on board was terrified. The gasoline had them thinking that the next bit of red-hot flak, a spark from the damaged wiring, anything, might turn them into a flying fireball. There was nothing they could do to stop the fuel rushing into the fuselage, and no way to get the gas out, so they sloshed around in it as they continued looking for German fighters that might want an easy target. Meanwhile, the pilot was struggling to keep the plane aloft with just 2 engines on one side of the plane. The plane was descending quickly, even with the remaining engines pushed to their limits. "We gotta lighten the load! Get rid of everything! Everything!" the pilot called out on the intercom. "The guns, ammunition, anything you can throw out." The crew reacted quickly, heaving out anything they could pick up. Chairs, spare equipment, ammunition boxes, and finally the big .50 caliber machine guns. They hated to fly without the big guns, their only defense against a fighter attack, but they were desperate to get lighter and stay aloft. All the while, as they were heaving the gear over, Wilson and the other crew thought the gasoline might explode at any moment. By now, they were all soaked in it. They could feel the caustic liquid burning their skin as they worked. The fumes stung their eyes and burned in their noses. They knew that if the fuel ignited, They had no hope of survival. This was the worst, Wilson thought, sweat pouring off his face even in the frigid air. Not only am I going to die on this mission, but I'm going to burn to death. The lighter load enabled the plane to hold its altitude enough to get over the first chain of mountains on the way back to Italy, and once he was finished throwing out anything not essential to flying the plane, Wilson saw something that surprised him. The rest of the squadron had stayed with them. His B-17 was crippled, flying low and slow, but the rest of the formation had stayed with it instead of continuing on. Wilson was surprised and elated. At least they weren't alone. The safety of numbers proved its value before long when German fighters showed up and immediately zeroed in on Wilson's B-17 as the weak point of the formation. His crew couldn't do anything since their machine guns had been thrown overboard, and they knew that just one lucky shot by a German pilot would send the B-17 up like a Roman candle. All they could do was crouch and try to avoid any stray gunfire as the other bombers in the formation fired on the German planes, swooping in and out of the formation. Wilson scarcely breathed for several long minutes, and then the fighters turned, leaving the bomber formation on its own again. With the situation calm again but far from resolved, Wilson and several other crew members turned their attention back to Norton, the engineer with the serious head wound. They knew they might have to bail out of the dying plane before long, and they worried that Norton might not be in any shape to parachute out and land safely. They debated what to do. "We could just pull his chute and throw him out. It should open okay," one man offered. "He'd land like a bag of bricks. He's barely awake," another countered. "That thing in his head has him all messed up. Besides, if he lands hard and hits his head, he might just jam that thing in deeper. It would kill him right away." Wilson agreed and offered the only solution he could think of. He didn't like the idea, but he said it anyway. "We need to pull that shrapnel out," Wilson said. They all looked over to Norton, who was still too groggy to know what they were talking about. Nobody wanted to do it, but Wilson volunteered. "I need some pliers." It took a while because the toolboxes had been thrown overboard, but Wilson came up with a set of pliers and went over to Norton, followed by 3 other crew members. One held Norton's shoulders firmly and another tried to steady his head as Wilson went in with the pliers. He wanted to do it quickly and firmly. He couldn't stand the thought of wrenching and twisting on something that might be deep in Norton's brain. One good yank pulled the jagged metal out of Norton's head, and Wilson threw it down in disgust. Over the next half hour, the injured man recovered his senses somewhat, and the crew felt more confident that he would be able to bail out if that time came. That time came in short order. The 2 engines on the undamaged side of the plane had been pushed beyond their limits, and, as expected, they started to overheat and churn out thick black smoke. The pilot, William J. Kilpatrick, gave the order that everyone knew was coming sooner or later. "Abandon ship. Bail out now." The crew members were ready for the order, and after making sure Norton made it out, they started tumbling out of the side door, one after another. Wilson jumped out and braced for the jerk of the chute on his harness, welcoming it even as he cringed with pain. He had made it out of that flying bomb alive, and assuming he could make it to the ground without running into any ignition sources, he wouldn't burst into flames the way he had been fearing for hours. But even as Wilson realized his worst fear would not come to pass, he saw more tragedy unfold. This terrible day was not even close to finished. Wilson hung under his parachute, gently gliding to whatever fate awaited him on the ground, and watched his B-17 continue on without him. He looked around and could see several other chutes in the air, and he thought he saw 7 others, plus his. That was 8 chutes in the air. Good. That means we're all out except for the pilot and co-pilot. Wilson knew that when bomber crews bailed out, it was customary for the pilot and co-pilot to be the last out because they remained at their post as long as possible, holding the plane steady to facilitate everyone else's bailout. Wilson kept his eyes on the B-17, waiting for the other 2 chutes to appear. He could see that another bomber had dropped out of the formation to fly alongside the crippled bomber, its crew watching intently as the young men bailed out one by one. The crew of the other plane was especially interested in the outcome of this drama because Kilpatrick, the pilot on the ailing plane, was the pilot that usually led most of the crew on the other, undamaged B-17. The crew rotations had split them up that day, and Kilpatrick's regular crew members wanted to make sure he made it out of the damaged plane safely. Several of them were at the hatch on that side of their bomber, watching the damaged plane. Kilpatrick's buddies in the other bomber flew alongside, counting the parachutes as Wilson and his fellow crew bailed out. Then they watched intently to see Kilpatrick and the co-pilot bail. The entire crew on the other plane was watching out the windows and hatches, wanting to count 10 chutes and be certain their crew leader had made it. Wilson watched too, praying that everyone would make it out safely. Then the two B-17s flew into a cloud, obscuring the moment when the pilot and co-pilot bailed out. Wilson saw their chutes emerge a moment later from underneath the cloud. He was relieved, realizing his entire crew had made it out safely, but then he felt a horrific knot in his stomach as he saw the two bombers emerge from the cloud, still side by side. The undamaged B-17 was not breaking away even though all of Wilson's crew had made it out, and they were rapidly approaching a mountainside. Oh my God, they didn't see the pilots get out, they're still waiting. Wilson understood that Kilpatrick's regular crewmates had not seen him bail out because they were in a cloud, and now it looked like they were so focused on waiting for 2 more chutes that they didn't realize they were following the crippled plane down. All he could do was hang there under his chute and watch. They're out. Pull up. He watched helplessly as both planes crashed into the mountainside. Everyone had made it out of Wilson's damaged B-17. All 10 crew on the other plane died as the bombers exploded and fell in heaps on the mountain. Wilson floated there in eerie silence, gently moving through the sky wherever the breeze sent him. All he could do was turn his head to the side and close his eyes tightly. He couldn't stand to look anymore.